From DLA Piper, this is the Beyond the Curve podcast. In this episode, Duke University Athletic Director Nina King and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Athletic Director Bubba Cunningham join DLA Piper's Richard Burr for a wide-ranging conversation on the future of the Atlantic Coast Conference, including the issue of name, image, and likeness.
I'm Richard Burr, Principal Policy Advisor at DLA Piper in Washington, and I want to thank you for joining another edition of Beyond the Curve, brought to you by DLA Piper. Today's topic is NIL, name, image, and likeness. And my guests today are Nina King, Athletic Director from Duke University, and Bubba Cunningham, Athletic Director from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before I start pillowing you with questions, I want our listeners to know about the incredible life experience both of you have had. So let me first start by congratulating both schools, not just on, in your case, Bubba, number 1 men's seed in the West, and Nina, number 4 seed men's in the South. Bubba, number 8 women's seed in the tournament, and Nina, number 7 women's seed in the tournament. So equally matched as it relates to lineups. And if you thought the last few were busy, Bubba, you're going to be just as busy these next few weeks. Nina King is the Vice President and Director of Athletics and Adjunct Professor of Business Administration at Duke University. Born in Tampa, Florida, she was named AD at Duke in 2021. It shouldn't be a surprise that she's the first woman athletic director at Duke University. She served in almost every role you can serve in the athletic department before she became athletic director. Her undergraduate degree was from Notre Dame. She's a graduate of Tulane Law School. And prior to Duke, she was the director of rules at Notre Dame for the athletic department. I think the most interesting thing, Nina, about you is that you used to babysit for Bubba Cunningham's children when he was on staff at Notre Dame and you were a student. Is that a true statement?
It is. I was an intern in the athletic department, and interns were always trying to make some extra money. So the Cunninghams were a great family for me to work with.
Well, that explains why Bubba's so old. I can say that. Bubba served as athletic director for 12 years at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's been a Division I athletic director for 18 years. Born in Flint, Michigan. Bubba, I didn't know that. We're going to have to talk Michigan at some point. You earned a bachelor's and a master's degree at Notre Dame. Member of the Irish golf team. Bubba, your wife, you've got 4 grown children. Both of you have so many numerous athletic accomplishments that I wasn't going to go through the list of all the recognition that you've got. This is just to say that we couldn't have 2 finer representatives from 2 better schools to talk about the future of college athletics and specifically name, image, and likeness, which has received a great deal of attention. So if we can, let's move right into it. And I think this is really for both of you. What was broken so badly that we needed something as radical a change as NIL? I'll start with you, Nina.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having us both. And Bubba and I, we love working together most days, except for when we compete against each other on the court or on the field. So an honor to be with you, Senator, and my fine colleague, Bubba. In terms of NIL and what was so broken, I'm not quite sure you can pinpoint exactly, but I would say we didn't move forward fast enough. The enterprise didn't modernize and really adapt to changing landscape fast enough. And we've been so reactive for so long that trying to play catch up and then really innovate and move forward has been a challenge. So we find ourselves in the position that we are relative to NIL specifically, trying to implement some rules, but then battling lawsuits all over the country and really trying to modernize an antiquated organization. So I think that's kind of where I would characterize how we got to this place.
Bubba?
Yeah, I agree exactly with what Nina said. I think the commercial activity of college sports has grown exponentially, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. And I don't think we were ready for that. And it's not necessarily the growth of the commercial activity that's the problem. It's the use of the money. The skyrocketing salaries and the great facilities that we've built, it really has created a big disproportion between the educational value that the students are receiving and the salaries associated with coaching the same position. I do think that the commercial activity has grown exponentially in the last 10 to 15 years, and the disparity between the value of a scholarship for a student and the salary for the coach has just gotten so extraordinary that it drove us to this position. And I will say, Senator, you were the very first ones to recognize the challenges that would bring if we even walked into this NIL activity.
Well, as you know, and I don't know if Nina knows this, I actually played football at Wake Forest, so I was one of those scholarship athletes. I remember how the NCAA, Bubba, early on started cleaning up the money that was out there. And they really did a good job of getting, I think, boosters out of the business of credit cards and cash and that type of thing. And we all learned to live on $15 laundry money a month, and I think $75 a quarter book money. That isn't even the world that existed before NIL. I think part of the argument for NIL was people suggested that these athletes were going through hardships. Can both of you address what you do to make sure that student athletes don't have a hardship, whether it's a death at home and they need transportation, whether it's health care, whether it's safety concerns? How does Chapel Hill look at that, and what type of wraparound program do you have?
Well, you're right. And when those disparities in salaries and scholarships got so great, what we tried to do as an association was invest in the students. And we created rules that allowed us to provide more benefits to students. We have unlimited meals for our students now. We have cost of attendance now. We have incredible academic support for our student athletes. Our mental health programs are better than they've ever been. The support services with athletic training and the medical care, someone referred to it as concierge service. It's outstanding. So the commercial activity has driven us to a place that is unusual, but we have tried to take that revenue that we've created and provide more services to our student athletes. The academic support has grown tremendously in the past couple of years. We have unlimited food for student athletes. We have cost of attendance for student athletes. We have great psychological services for our student athletes, and the medical care is as good as anything in the country. And we provide that for all 800 student athletes.
Nina, how about at Duke?
Very similar. It really is about the student athlete experience, and a generous portion of our budget is going towards all of those services, and really not to be redundant with services that are provided on campus. Of course, on campus, there's mental health and psychologists and those resources for students, but we really want to provide an elite high level experience for our student athletes so that we can make it additive. Additional sports performance and mental health and performance psychologists here that specialize in the pressures of being a student, but also an athlete and performing at your best every day, those types of things. So, I mean, we have really put a lot into that experience. But then when you add each year more and more and more, that's where the stresses on our budget come, especially with, as Bubba mentioned, the skyrocketing salaries on the compensation side.
So let me ask this. You guys are in charge of coaches. You're the athletic director, and then you got the school. What does the school, the athletic director, and the coach say to the student athletes that are on scholarship that don't get paid?
Well, I mean, don't get paid is a very basic way of saying it. In terms of a full scholarship student athlete that's receiving scholarship plus tuition, books, room and board, cost of attendance, and then everything that we just outlined that is provided for them and to be a student athlete. At Duke, we looked at that for a 4-year full scholarship student athlete. It's well over $500,000 in benefits. So you both were collegiate student athletes. I was not. It took me a long time to pay off my student loans after I left college. So not getting paid is a little bit of a misnomer, I think. Now, in terms of cash in the pocket, we are looking at other ways where we can provide additional benefits to student athletes. The Alston case allowed us to provide academic awards in the form of cash to our student athletes. A student athlete that is living off campus receives their room and board in a check. So if their rent is less than what they're receiving in terms of a stipend, then they're making more money there. I think we can continue to find opportunities for them to continue to make money. And NIL, in its purest form, is one of those ways where allowing our student athletes to profit off of their own name, image, and likeness to make money for themselves, I think is a good thing. So I would just make sure that folks are aware of everything that goes into the student athlete's pocket, whether it's cash or other types of benefits.
And listen, let me say thank you for answering it the way you did, because that was my hope, is that for the average school out there today, a school's investing $500,000 in a 4-year experience where, one, you play a sport, and two, you get an education. Bubba, state-supported school at Chapel Hill, but the numbers are no different, are they?
No, they're not. The tuition's a little bit less, but we're providing the same resources to student athletes. And the whole idea of college is to come, learn, gain experiences to prepare you for life and prepare you for a career, whether it's 5 years after college, if you're going to go and try to play professionally. But the whole idea is preparation for that next step. It's not make your money while you're here. And I think we've lost sight of that notion. But NIL was designed, as Nina said, to help close the gap for those that have marketability. But what we've seen in the last few months is it's not just about those with marketability. It's about paying to acquire talent, paying for students to play a particular sport.
So let's talk about that word that until 2 years ago we really didn't hear, the word portal. And I think it was the net result of COVID, and NCAA changed their rules. When I was a student athlete, if you wanted to switch schools, you had to sit out a year. I think you had to pick up that 1 year's education yourself. It couldn't be done by either school. There was a real sacrifice that you made in your career to make that decision. Now it seems almost weekly. I'm speeding it up a little bit too much, but how do you see the portal? Does it work? Should it stay, or should we go back to the old rules? Bubba?
I don't think we're going to go backwards. But the reason the rules that were in place when you were playing were to make sure that you graduated. The data shows that the longer you stayed at an institution, the more likely you are to graduate. So we did relax the rules for most sports, but football, the two basketballs, baseball, were the sports that we said, look, we recognize these are low graduation rates. So we put a rule in that said, if you transfer, you have to sit out a year. We're allowed to pay for your tuition at the other school, but you have to sit a year to get academically acclimated. And that worked for about 20 years. Our graduation rates in those sports rose. But what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years, people said, you know what? That restricts students' mobility. A coach can leave, the student should be able to leave. The discussion is about mobility and opportunity, not about education and graduation. And that's just a difference in philosophy that today's society has. So we had to back off those rules to create the portal. Now we're seeing it compounded with NIL, and somebody is recruiting somebody off your team to go play somewhere else, and they'll give you money. Our transfer rates are high, and over time, I do think we're going to see lower graduation rates.
Nina, how about it, Duke? How do you see it?
I don't disagree with anything that Bubba said. And unfortunately, with zero restrictions now, I mean, we could see student athletes transferring multiple times during the same academic year. If they're not having a good experience in their first semester, then potentially going to another school their second semester, and then even the next year transferring again. So that's not in anybody's best interest. In terms of restricting our student athletes, though, I want them to have the same opportunities that a non-student athlete could have. So let's take the philosophy student who is not a student athlete, that is not having a good experience at Duke and wants to transfer to another institution, maybe wants to go closer to home or a different academic program. And they could leave and go to the next school with very little restrictions. It's going to be what credits transfer into the new institution and whatnot. And I think student athletes should have that same opportunity. But transferring credits are going towards graduation. Are you staying eligible? Are you on track to graduate? I think that's really, really important, because we are tethered to the academy here. And that is the purpose right now for student athletes to be in school and stay eligible. So on the flip side, feel really bad for our coaches and trying to determine who their rosters are. They're trying to set schedules based on who they think is on their team, but they're just not quite sure. And then the trickle-down effect, the impact on high school student athletes, probably being negatively impacted and not having as many opportunities because coaches are focused on recruiting student athletes out of the transfer portal. So just the unintended consequences of the transfer portal are really impactful here.
Speaking of unintended consequences, I'd like to drill down into specifically women's sports. Nina, what would happen to women's sports if revenue sharing was required?
I mean, is this podcast about 4 hours for us to talk through all of these impacts?
Both of you mentioned numerous times unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think NIL has some very specific unintended consequences. And I believe getting them on the table as early as we possibly can talking about the individuals that may be disadvantaged, not advantaged, but disadvantaged is really, really important because this could be life-changing for people.
Absolutely. I think for our women's sports as well as our male Olympic sports, they're certainly in jeopardy here as we talk about revenue sharing, and mainly for football and men's basketball. The revenue that we bring in as an athletic department really does allow us to provide the experience across all of the rest of our sports. We are very proud of providing 27 different programs here. Same in Chapel Hill, 27, you guys. So to be able to support student athletes across all of these sports is really important to us. So if we start talking about revenue sharing and compensating student athletes, football, and then to some extent men's basketball is really where the conversations are centering around right now. It threatens our model. And then the trickle-down effect of that, and I'm sure Bubba can give us a bit on this, is then it threatens the Olympic model and us providing student athletes to our national teams and having those experiences. So I do truly worry this is a threat to our female and our Olympic sports student athletes. And I think a lot of us are recognizing that. And in terms of solutions, I think we've got a long way to go to figure out how do we truly protect that experience.
So, Bubba, let me ask this. If a school has to make a strategic decision to drop men's football because they can't compete with the money that's flying around, and they eliminate those number of scholarships, what's the impact then at that school for female athletes and scholarships?
Well, I don't really think anyone is going to drop a football program because you're defined at the NCAA level by your football program. Division I is made up of FBS, FCS, and then the non-football playing schools. So if you want to be in Division I, you're defined by football, either no scholarship, 65 or 85. So I don't see somebody saying we're going to go from 85 to 0. I do think some of the FCF schools, just the cost of it could be a problem for them, but that's a huge step for somebody to take. And adding on to what Nina was saying, is the economic model of college sports is changing. I think we revenue share today. As Nina indicated, we have two sports that supply the money for everybody else. But the debate and discussion now is those that generate the money should get the money. And if you do that, then how do you support the other sports? And I also feel like crying wolf that we've said for 50 years we can't afford to do this, and the money continues to rise. So I think we are at a point now where if we are truly revenue sharing like pro sports do, I think we're going to be challenged. And the question about Title IX is in the educational environment, we do have to provide equitable opportunities and equitable experiences. This NIL and commercial activity associated with the individual is new space because we know what Title IX looks like, and we've been very good at that. We know what Title VII looks like for compensation for employees. This is the gray area that we're going to need either guidance from the federal government, guidance from the Department of Education, tax advice. We're not sure where NIL is going to fit into an educational environment.
Well, we're going to get to all of those before we finish this podcast today, I will assure you. I want to make sure that I remember my story correctly from Chapel Hill. The concessions from sports, those jersey sales and that type of thing, actually funded non-athletic scholarships at UNC Chapel Hill. So in this particular case, the unintended consequence, if you have to share with the individual whose jersey was sold, you're taking away scholarships from non-athletic students.
Not necessarily, because right now we'll sell a jersey that has a number and a Carolina across the top. That's revenue that the school's going to get. If we sell a jersey that has a number and a name on the back, and then we would have to raise the licensing fee so the university and the individual would share in that revenue. So it would be a more expensive jersey. And they're telling me that about 70% of NFL licensed merchandise is co-branded between the individual player and the name on the front of the jersey. So I do think there's some upside for student athletes, but at the collegiate level, it's not huge money. It's not that much.
It's time for us to dig a little bit deeper and to really get to some serious issues. Let me ask this. Should student athletes be employees of the university?
That's an easy one. Nina can take that one.
My answer is no. I mean, we just talked about all of the benefits that we provide for them. I think it becomes extremely complicated when they're employees. All of the issues that come along with employment taxes. What are you paying taxes on? Overtime, FMLA, FLSA, all of the federal laws that go along with being an employee. So I think it's taking us down a really slippery slope when we talk about employment for student athletes.
It's a tricky one, but at North Carolina, there are 6,000 students on this campus that we pay. And part of me says we should be able to figure that out if we go down this path. And we may be forced to by what the NLRB is saying, whether obviously a private school is different than a public with NLRB jurisdiction. But if the joint employment theory that's being tossed around, that you can be an employee of the Atlantic Coast Conference or the NCAA, not just the University of North Carolina, that they may have some jurisdiction over those student athletes. So those will be tough choices for schools to make. Some just aren't going to do that, while others might make the choice to do it. So these next couple of months, these court cases are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and let me just say, Bubba, we've watched one example of the Oscars. The people that go to the Oscars get these unbelievable gift bags. IRS made a determination they're going to be taxed on them. So if you've got a student athlete that's an employee of the university, it's very reasonable to believe that the IRS is going to look at room, board, tuition, and now say everything's taxable because it's compensation for being an employee. You could actually have athletes that lose money because of being an employee of the university. Bubba, take on, if you will, just briefly, the consequences that could happen if other schools choose to unionize like Dartmouth men's basketball, because that really does change the rules. I think Nina got into all the different labor things that you got to follow for employees. But all of a sudden, if they're unionized, they get to dictate what happens.
Right. And I think that's why Charlie Baker, the head of the NCAA, is going to Congress and trying to say, we need standardized rules across 50 states. We have 1,100 schools in all 50 states are competing. We're trying to have national competition. There has to be some consistency in regulation and what the benefits associated with participation at one school is over the other. So I think it's appropriate that we ask those questions. I'm not sure Congress is going to solve it for us, but if they don't, I think we should be looking at our own ways to solve it, which unfortunately, when you're in violation of antitrust, there's only two ways to get out of it. One is to get a federal exemption, or two, collectively bargain. I guess the third temporary solution is settlement of some of these cases, which would be a Band-Aid approach to the current issues that we're facing.
We've talked about the need for Congress to act, and Senator Cruz and others have initiatives on the Hill to hopefully sort this out and give predictable pathways. Comments from both of you as to whether Congress should or should not get involved.
Well, I mean, I think we need their help. We've got state laws in so many different states and all differing laws relative to NIL. And here we are trying to compete with each other, and it's a very uneven playing field. So helping us out in the NIL space is certainly something we could use congressional help on. As Bubba mentioned, I mean, we need an antitrust exemption. If we can have maybe a special status for student athletes that's not employment status, or is there something before we codify student athletes as employees? So we do need Congress's help. And funny you mentioned that, because Bubba and I and our colleague from Wake Forest, John Curry, went up on Capitol Hill last week to go and talk with folks and explain from our perspective why we need their assistance. So I'm grateful that they were willing to listen. I don't know if it's something that can get done here in the near term. And as Bubba mentioned, if it doesn't, then we need to be preparing Plan B here pretty quickly. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves just in court for eternity and not being able to fix whatever this broken model is and really setting ourselves on a path forward.
I do think that Senator Cruz and Senator Booker are really trying hard to develop something they can both live with and we might be able to live with. What I've seen so far is, at least on the Democratic side, that they've been pushing toward education and healthcare. And I guess that's been on both sides, which we all agree with and we generally provide. I think compensation is going to be the issue that will bridge the gap, because I don't think healthcare and education is enough, quite frankly, to get the Democrats to say, yes, we believe in this, and that will give the NCAA or some governing body some type of antitrust exemption. Stopping short of compensation, I don't think we can get a bill that's strong enough that will be passed by both the House and the Senate.
So, Bubba, that begs me to ask this. The funding of college sports today. One, how does it look today? And two, where does it go in the future? And when I think about that, I think about alumni donations. I think about TV contracts. And I think you said on the NCAA or the ACC for TV contracts. What's the makeup of it percentage-wise, and where do you see it going?
Well, it continues to grow. And you talked about me being old, which I am, and Nina being young. And I don't know where it's going. But my first job when poor Nina was babysitting, our football coach was a guy named Lou Holtz. He was making $110,000 a year. And our basketball coach was a guy named Digger Phelps. That was even before Nina, was making $125,000. And the explosion of those salaries, and we never thought we could afford what we have today. So I don't think the commercial activity is going to grow forever, but I do think there's a couple of models out there that I think we can continue to grow revenue. And I think we need to continue to grow revenue so we can continue to sponsor Olympic sports, compensate the players, and continue with the growth that we've had without all of that coming directly from our donors. And I think that's where we need to focus our attention, because none of us want to go backwards with the sports that we offer, the opportunities that we offer, the experiences that these kids are getting. The only way not to do that is to continue to raise revenue in some capacity.
Nina, do you see where it goes?
Our biggest source of revenue, as you mentioned, are the media television contracts. And we are starting to see a forecast of a slowdown in how fast those dollars are growing. So, we need to be prepared for what else and how do we continue to grow revenue, because not only the salaries, but the cost of doing business, scholarship costs are growing at exponential rates on campus, and all of the other services, travel. I mean, our travel budgets are growing like crazy. And now you add the West Coast travel for all of our schools. And as we continue to add on the expense side, we certainly need to look and see what revenue model makes sense, because I don't think that we can bank on TV and media being it for us.
Well, we're seeing in the marketplace a great emphasis on streaming. Bubba, does it get eventually to a point where viewers are going to have to pay to watch college sports?
Well, I think so. I think they're doing that now through subscription with ESPN. That was one of the biggest economic drivers in the last 50 years, was subscription television on top of network television. So I do think another delivery of live content through streaming will be part of our future. But again, if we're in violation of antitrust, which we've been told we are twice, I think we need to try to get an antitrust exemption and take advantage of a monopoly situation, just like the professional sports leagues have, and drive the revenue to provide the opportunities that we're currently providing.
Well, let me end with this one, and I'll give it to you, Bubba. What do you think of Coach Saban's comments most recently about NIL and the need for Congress to get involved?
I was at the hearing when he spoke. I really wish coaches would speak up while they were coaching. He's a powerful voice, and he understands what the day-to-day is all about. And I think we're all wrestling with the imbalance in the commercial activity. He's trying to provide experiences for the student athletes. He is trying to prepare them for things after they compete. And how do we do that? We know that the economic challenges are there, and NIL doesn't seem to be the answer. A compensation model that seems to be more transparent and understandable is probably a better way to go. But boy, it's such a square peg in a round hole at a university. And you talked about the tax implications to things like that. We need to discuss it and come up with a plan, because college athletics are so important to so many schools and so many individuals. The amount of kids that get to go to college and play and get an education, we have to maintain that. But we also have to find something that's going to be a little bit more beneficial to those that generate it.
We also need to face the reality that a very small percentage of college athletes will become professional athletes. It's not in the cards, and I'm a great example of it. And what I've got to fall back on is a great education. And that education is then my platform. And I might also add all the connections that I made, not just at Wake Forest, but throughout the conference, people that I stay in touch with still today, people that offer business opportunities to young kids, not because of their athletic talent, because of what they learned up here, whether it's Duke, whether it's Chapel Hill, whether it's Wake Forest, or any of the schools. That's the single most important thing. And I think that's what hurts me the most, is that education has gotten lost in the national debate. I know it hadn't at the campuses, it hadn't in your offices, but it has with the general public. They think this is all about money, and it's not. It really is about making sure that, one, we give them a great education, two, they graduate, and three, they're prepared for life. And listen, I just thank both of you for what your institutions do and for what the athletic organizations do. The quality of the coaches that you have and the way they're mentors, I still see at both schools. Coach K's there at a game. Roy's there at a game. If Dean was still alive, he'd be there at the game. I know, Bubba, but those are memories that everybody will cherish, and their impacts that impact every student athlete's lives. So I hate to say it, we're at the end of another edition of Beyond the Curve from DLA Piper. My guests today have been Nina King and Bubba Cunningham, two great athletic directors. I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And to our listeners, we look forward to the next edition of Beyond the Curve.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Beyond the Curve podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper, LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper, LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.